Good evening, everyone. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, I thought I'd introduce myself. I'm Jane Potter. I'm the chair of the Wilfred Owen Association. And on behalf of the committee, I really want to welcome all of you here tonight to celebrate Wilfred Owen's birthday. And it's a delight to see so many people here. This is probably the biggest draw we've ever had, which is wonderful. And that's sort of, as I think I've said on previous occasions, one of at least the positive outcomes of COVID has been showing us that we can have these meetings online and at least get together and attract a much wider audience than we would have ever done before. So thank you so much for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. The talk is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel shortly, where the last two talks are also there for people to listen to and to watch. We'll put all of these links in the chat in due course. Please, can you ensure that you're on mute for the duration, as they say? This just reduces the background noise and makes it a little easier to concentrate. Please put any questions in the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can put this in at any time during the talk, and we will get to these in order at the end, and there will be time for questions. If you prefer to ask a question yourself or to contribute a thought or whatever, just put that in the chat as well, and we'll call on you at the end to unmute and add your questions. But I'm more than happy to ask them on your behalf. So without further ado, I want to welcome our guest speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Norgate. Paul studied at Trinity College, Cambridge, Merton College, Oxford, and the University of Birmingham. For over 25 years, he was head of English in a secondary school, both in this country and abroad. He's also taught in higher education and was associate lecturer at Cambridge University Institute of Continuing Education. Latterly, he was chair of examiners for A-level and GCSE at Cambridge University Examinations Syndicate. Paul first encountered Owen's poetry while teaching in the 1970s and has tested the patience of his family, I think we all have, by thinking, teaching, lecturing, and writing about Owen ever since. While still teaching, he went on to write a PhD thesis on Owen and popular writing from the First World War. In his retirement, Paul lectures, writes, and publishes on a range of literary topics, but of course, mostly Wilfred Owen. So over to you, Paul, and welcome. You're muted.
Is that better? Hey. Okay, I'll just put on my first slideshow, which is very short. And I will say thank you very much to Jane for that welcome, and to everybody else. It's very good to see so many people here tonight. And as Jane said, one of the benefits that Zoom has brought with it. I think, first of all, I ought to thank Jane and the Wilfred Owen Association Committee for inviting me, especially Meg Crane included there. The very first online birthday lecture. So thank you very much. Well, you might think that by this time, over 100 years on, there's not much that we don't know about Wilfred Owen. And I'm rather pleased to say this evening that you'd be mistaken. What I'm going to talk about this evening was originally sparked, I think, by an article in the TLS, the Times Lit, at the end of last year, which set out to celebrate the relationship between Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, which is very well known, of course. Unfortunately, I'm afraid the article, at least I felt, did not add much to what we know, and rather sadly, it misrepresented quite a bit of what we do know. So I sat down to try and offer some corrections to that article, and that's how I found myself drawn into this, what I think is a rather fascinating episode in Wilfred Owen's life story. And it is one which, as far as I know, has not been explored before. So I hope you find it as interesting as I have. Thanks for coming. and I'm just going to switch my PowerPoint presentation, and then off we go with Wilfred Owen and Mrs Fullerton. That's a good start, isn't it, folks? It would help if I actually opened the right screen. So let's go back to where we were. I do beg your pardon for that. That's the right one. Okay, so safely preserved in this building, the Western Library, which is part of the Bodleian in Oxford, is the collection of books which Wilfred Owen left behind him when he was killed in France at the end of 1918. That collection nowadays is rather grandly entitled Wilfred Owen's Personal Library, but it actually contains at least one volume that was never actually owned by Owen in his lifetime, and that is a small leather-bound volume, Longfellow's Hiawatha. In the front of that booklet, there are two handwritten inscriptions. One is on the half title, and I'm afraid you can't get a camera in to actually photograph it, but it says, Harold, Christmas 1923. Harold, of course, as many of you will know, was Wilfred Owen's younger brother. On the flyleaf, there's another inscription, which fortunately is accessible to the camera. And there it is. It reads, in memory of the reading of Hiawatha, autumn 1917, Edinburgh, M.K. Fullerton, Alnwick, autumn 1918. So this little book was a gift. It marked a one-year anniversary. And of course, the gift originally would be for Wilfred, because he is the one who was in Edinburgh in autumn 1917. At that time, Wilfred Owen was at Craiglockhart War Hospital on the southern outskirts of Edinburgh. And if you're familiar with the letters that Wilfred Owen wrote, you will know that whilst he was at Craiglockhart, he spent some time teaching at a nearby school, Tynecastle. M.K. Fullerton, who signed that inscription, was a teacher at Tynecastle, and it was Mrs. Fullerton's class that Wilfred Owen worked with. If you're very familiar with Owen's letters, you will recall that he tells his mother that Hiawatha was indeed one of the texts that he used when he was teaching. And if you are very, very familiar with Owen's letters, you will know that the editors of his collected letters actually give Mrs. Fullerton a footnote. They say she was Mrs. Edward Fullerton. H.O. met her after the war. Well, H.O. of course is Harold. And so we can begin to sketch in the outline of the story. Wilfred Owen met Mrs. Fullerton at Tynecastle School, and together they shared the teaching of Hiawatha. Owen left Craiglockhart and he went back to rejoin his regiment in Scarborough. Mrs. Fullerton too left Edinburgh, and a year on, now she was in Alnwick in Northumberland, a year on she wanted to send Wilfred Owen a memento on the anniversary of their working together. But Owen had already made his way back to France, and in November he was killed. And then, as the inscription here tells us, 5 years later, well after the war, Mrs. Fullerton and Owen's brother Harold met somehow and made contact, and the gift was entrusted to Harold to be kept with Wilfred Owen's legacy. And already perhaps you will begin to sense some of the poignancy that there is in this story. Owen's acquaintanceship with Mrs Fullerton in Edinburgh was brief, a matter of weeks, but he must have made quite an impression for her to wish to mark that anniversary with a gift. Did she make an equal impression on him? The anniversary of their meeting fell only a few weeks before Owen's death. When did the news of his death reach her? Had she already sent that book to the Owen family home? Did it wait there unopened? How long? Before somebody, Harold, finally found it? Or perhaps she'd never posted it and kept it safe because she was unsure where to address it. And after the war, was it she who made contact with the Owen family because perhaps she knew that Owen was now dead? Questions, questions. I think Mrs. Edward Fullerton did indeed make an impression on Wilfred Owen, and that's my topic tonight. His friendship with her is an intriguing episode, and the story of it reaches out beyond the friendship itself into what we know about Owen, about his relationship with his mother, and, perhaps rather surprisingly, about his much more famous relationship with Siegfried Sassoon. Before the war, before he was a soldier or a real poet, and insofar as he had a profession, Wilfred Owen was a teacher in Shrewsbury in his teens, at Dunsdon at the end of his teens, in France in his early 20s. And it was a role he continued until 1915, when he returned home from his tutoring in France to join the army. In late summer 1917, the army withdrew Owen from his first tour of duty, invalided him back to the UK, and sent him to Craiglockhart to recover from shell shock. A key feature of the regime promoted by his doctor there, Dr Brock, called Ergo Therapy by Dr Brock himself, involved getting him into a variety of practical activities. And in Owen's case, these included editing the hospital magazine, writing his own poetry, visiting the slums of Edinburgh. And no doubt, in deciding which activities a patient should focus on, Dr Brock would have discussed with him what his aptitudes, interests, and/or previous experience, and what might be relevant. So, given Owen's background, it's perhaps not surprising that Brock arranged for him to join a scheme whereby a number of the officers from Craiglockhart would go to do some teaching at Tynecastle School. Tynecastle is now in a new building. That's the original one, which is still standing. Interestingly, perhaps because he had this experience in teaching, Owen was actually the only one of the officers from Craiglockhart who was actually going to teach twice a week at the school. And he was the only one teaching part of the academic curriculum, English literature. The others were all teaching more military subjects like map reading, signalling, and the like. Well, Owen's first mention of his work at Tynecastle comes in a letter he wrote to his mother, dated 27th of September. This morning, I gave my first lesson of a course of English literature in a big school in Edinburgh. I had 39 boys who seemed most intelligently attentive. A week later, he tells her, I've been to school again. I'm going to do a Hiawatha with them now. And a fortnight after that, 19th of October, he asked her to find a book on his shelves at home and to cut out and send him a number of fine photographs of redskins, presumably for use alongside Hiawatha. And on the 22nd of October, he had to remind her, I'm looking out for the redskin photographs. Well, alongside the Hiawatha project, you remember, as I said, he was teaching twice a week. Alongside Hiawatha, Owen worked with the Tynecastle boys on a novel by Robert Louis Stevenson. Not one of his best though, perhaps. St. Ives, or perhaps, since the title character is a Frenchman, that should be Saint Yves. And it is perhaps a slightly odd choice for teaching boys in a classroom, since it's a novel that Stevenson actually left unfinished when he died, And as you can see there, Sir Arthur Quiller Couch had to add a conclusion. But while the setting of Hiawatha needed redskin photographs to bring it to life, St Ives had the attraction of being set in and around Edinburgh. A letter to his mother on the 9th of October makes it clear that Owen was planning a St Ives themed field trip. Part of this letter is damaged or missing, so it begins in the middle of a sentence, but you can work out what he's talking about. He says something like, we're going to arrange a visit with some of the boys to Swanston Cottage, Stevenson's, you know. We're reading St Ives. Many scenes occur there, that's at the cottage, and at the castle in Edinburgh, and even on the road just outside the Hydro, which is what Craig Lockhart used to be known as before the war. Swanston Cottage it still stands, at the foot of the Pentland Hills, only a few miles south of Craig Lockhart. For many years, the cottage was the residence of the Stevenson's family for their summer holidays, even though, even in the time of Robert Louis, it was in fact a cottage no longer, having been extended into a fairly substantial two-storey house. The descriptions in the novel, St Ives, of the house in which the heroine lives, Flora Gilchrist, are based on Stevenson's memory of his childhood summers spent at Swanston Cottage. And Wilfred Owen was evidently hoping to exploit these local connections to support his teaching. In a letter of the 14th of October, he describes a Sunday walk out to the village of Collington, a little village in those days, not too far from Craig Lockhart and a few miles from Swanston Cottage. There he met a Mr. Walter Blakey. Blakey had been a boyhood friend of Robert Louis Stevenson, but Blakey had gone on to become chairman of T&A Constable Limited, printers to the University of Edinburgh. And Owen found him to have commerce rather than romance in his soul. He wrote to his mother, "It's a beautiful thing that the children of Tynecastle School are able to get nearer to the romantic heart of Stevenson than this person who played with Stevenson before even Treasure Island was dreamt of." So it was obviously no good expecting Walter Blakey to inspire the boys from Tynecastle School. Swanston Cottage itself, this is a painting from the period. The cottage itself was also part of this plan of Wilfred Owen's. On 19th of October, he wrote to his mother, "I'm to meet Lord Guthrie on Saturday at Swanston." Well, Guthrie was the current occupant of the cottage, and Owen was no doubt hoping to charm his lordship into allowing some of the Tynecastle boys to visit. But the boot, as you can see here, was on the other foot. It was Owen who was the target of a charm offensive. On Saturday, I went to Swanston and fell into a trap. Lord Guthrie wants me to do some historical research work for him in the Edinburgh libraries. I was not at all keen. So once again, his plans were frustrated. Despite these disappointments, though, he'd already arranged an outing, apparently, and it went ahead the very next day, the Sunday. And that same evening, Sunday, the 21st of October, Owen wrote to his mother about it. He begins in a whimsical mock journalese style. "It was a puzzle and a mystery to many, the party of 6 that assembled this afternoon at Braid Hills tram terminus, and began a saunter into the Pentland Hills. People saw a married lady, an obviously unmarried young man in a reckless soft cap, a well-dressed boy with violet eyes and tie, an ill-dressed thin boy with an intellect behind his parchment forehead, a fat little knave, apparently with an apple stowed under each cheek in case of emergency, and a tall, awkward boy, very nervous of himself." The married lady, of course, was Mrs Fullerton, the class teacher from Tynecastle, the unmarried young man with the cap, Owen himself, and the 4 boys, pupils from Mrs Fullerton's class. The Tynecastle contingent had taken the tram out of Edinburgh to Braid Hills, south of the city, while Owen walked about a mile or so, I think it must have been, across country from Craiglockhart to meet them at the terminus. His letter describes how the group continued southward on foot towards the village of Swanston and the slopes of the Pentland Hills, there you are, and then up a lane to the cottage itself. Lord Guthrie, of course, had not invited them into the cottage, but not to worry, says Owen. When we beheld the cottage to good advantage, we sat in the lee of a haystack and ate sandwiches. Well, I think this photograph was taken a month or so earlier because the haystack hasn't been built yet, but you can see the cottage in the trees and the cornfield. After their refreshments, the group continued their walk, looping westwards until at the end of the afternoon they reached Colinton, where they had some tea. Here's a quick outline of the map. You can see Braid Hills there where they started. They walked south to Swanston Cottage at the bottom and then across towards Colinton. And then from Colinton, they headed back to the Craiglockhart tram terminus, where the Tynecastle contingent could catch another tram back into Edinburgh, while Owen was practically on the doorstep of the nearby hospital. This is a contemporary map, as you can probably tell, and Colinton, Braid Hills, all those areas are now very much built up. And that big green line across the bottom of the map, if you know this area, you'll know that's the Edinburgh Southern Bypass, which cuts right through the countryside they walked through. Makes it a little difficult to see exactly where they would have walked. Even if it hadn't fulfilled all of Owen's educational aims, they'd evidently had a very enjoyable outing, I think. The weather had been good, if rather bracing. Owen says the finest wind the Pentlands can produce came to play with us, and October spared us the last of her sun remnants. They had seen Stevenson's cottage, there it is again in the bottom corner, and some of the landscapes of the novel by Stevenson. And although Owen doesn't actually mention it in his letter, the Pentland Hills scenery and views were no doubt as beautiful as ever. And there we are looking back the opposite direction towards Edinburgh in the far distance with the Firth of Forth behind. If you follow the arrow to that little clump of trees, you might work out that that's exactly where Swanston Cottage is. So it's lovely countryside. But that's enough of pretty pictures. This is the Wilfred Owen Association, so it's time for some textual analysis. The group on their outing had been in high spirits. Owen telling his mother how they sang songs and told tales, every now and then leaping about and prancing for joy. And his letter evokes with particular vividness the return leg of the outing through the October dusk from Colinton back towards Craiglockhart. It was already darkening when we reached Colinton, and quite dark when we took the Edinburgh Road. And so we took it in good style with songs and dancing, whistling and holloing, until the meteors showered in heaven and we fell calm under the winter stars, and some of us saw the pathway of the spirits for the first time. And seeing it so far above us and feeling the good road so firm beneath us, we worshipped God in our hearts and knew we loved one another as no men love for long. And that's a particularly striking passage, I think, at once lyrical and carefully crafted. That combination of vigorous physical activity and heightened awareness of the natural world gives it an almost Wordsworthian feel, I think. Wilfred Owen was rather pleased with it anyway, and the next day he added a postscript to his letter. I find I have put some poetic material on page 3, which ought to have been economized for my serious workshop. In fact, as we shall see, the context in which that poetic material turns up again is a rather unexpected one. And of course, as always when writing to his mother, Wilfred Owen in this letter is, shall we say, active on more than one front. Mrs. Owen would have spotted straight away that this Pentlands walk had taken place on a Sunday. So, by beginning in humorous vein and moving on to suggest an almost spiritual dimension to his outing and to his friendship, Wilfred, I think, was almost certainly, at least in part, attempting to anticipate and to soothe his mother's anxieties about his lapsed church going. We worship God in our hearts, he insists. And further to discourage maternal reproach, his next sentence is a slightly defiant, "That was my way of spending Sunday." However, while as often placating his mother might have been the starting point, the lyricism of that Winter Stars passage suggests to me something more immediate and powerfully felt on Owen's part. And his characterization of it as merely poetic effusion seems a little disingenuous. Another stratagem perhaps to distract his mother. The key to it seems to be that climactic phrase, "as no men love for long." What had elevated this outing to such a pitch of poetic intensity wasn't so much any beauty or novelty in the surroundings of the walk as the company with whom he shared it. And specifically, I think, the teacher from Tynecastle School. As I've suggested, Owen took his teaching placement at Tynecastle entirely seriously. In his first week there, he wrote to his mother that this teaching was one of the most humanly useful things I am doing now. As much as its human usefulness, however, it seems to have been the simple human contact involved, new friendships he was making, that particularly cheered him. And what his correspondence goes on to reveal is that Owen and the class teacher fell rapidly into a lively friendship. In his first week at Tynecastle, he wrote to his mother, excuse me, "Did I tell you what a great time I had on Tuesday with the 39 boys? Their teacher is a charming girl, wife, of course, of an army doctor." But he gives no more detail about this charming girl, except in a later letter where he indicates that actually she was only 23 years old. And Owen, of course, was only 24 at this time. So who was this charming girl? Well, in their rather terse footnote, the editors of the letters tell us that she was Mrs. Edward Fullerton and that Harold Owen met her after the war. Mrs. Edward Fullerton, or MK, as she signed herself in that Hiawatha gift, was born Mary Knox Howie, but she seems to have been generally known as Mamie rather than Mary. Mamie Howie lived near Duns in Berwickshire, not too far from Edinburgh, and it was presumably in Edinburgh that she met her future husband, Edward Fullerton. Edward Fullerton was an Irishman. He came from Bushmills, that's of whiskey fame, in County Antrim, and he was some years older than Mamie. He went across the sea to Edinburgh University to study medicine in 1910, and his career there is recorded in the University Roll of Honour for the 1418 conflict. After qualifying in 1915, Edward was promptly commissioned in the RAMC, and you might just be able to read there that he was attached coincidentally to the same regiment that Owen belonged to, the Manchesters, although he was in fact with a different battalion, the 21st. He qualified in 1915. Edward and Mamie were married that same year. In fact, even before the wedding announcement could appear in the press, here it is in one of the local newspapers back home in Ireland, Edward Fullerton, at present in France with the 21st Manchester Regiment. So even before the wedding notice could appear in the newspaper, he'd had to leave and go across to France. Wilfred Owen met Mamie Fullerton a couple of years later on his first day at Tynecastle. He described that meeting to his mother. Did I tell you what a great time I had on Tuesday with the 39 boys? The teacher's a charming girl, and so on. She had the exquisite tact to offer to leave me alone, but I requested her company for the rest of the lesson. Now, I've been quite intrigued by that phrase, exquisite tact. It captures, I like to think, a moment when Owen and Mrs Fullerton perhaps recognized each other as kindred spirits. In that offer to leave the newcomer alone with her class, what do we hear? Courtesy, certainly, respect, and of course, possibly an instruction from her superiors. But I think also elements of teasing humor, an ironic challenge. This Mr. Owen, did he know anything about teaching? Would he respond with that usual lazy masculine assumption of superiority? But as well as being confident in his teaching experience, Mr. Owen was surely not unaware of his own ability to charm. And it's pleasant to speculate for a non-academic moment on the momentary pause and the half smile that may have intervened before his gallant response, "By no means, madam, please do stay." Well, however it played out at the time, that brief exchange seems to have triggered a friendship which bloomed brightly and quickly, though it was fated not to last for long. Mamie Fullerton was certainly no stage schoolmarm, and Owen's use of inverted commas around teacher is perhaps an indication that her position in the school was hardly more permanent than his own. The fact that she was a girl of only 23 years perhaps hints at the difficulties schools sometimes had in filling vacancies during wartime. In fact, as Owen later reported to his mother, Mrs Fullerton was due to leave Tynecastle at the end of that same autumn term to be with her husband, who will get sent out again. So Edward Fullerton must have been due for home leave at the end of 1917. Now, Wilfred Owen himself faced a medical board each week at Craiglockhart Hospital, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he too would have to leave Craiglockhart to rejoin his regiment. Late in October, he wrote to his mother that "I am to be boarded next Tuesday and sent away." Well, it's not absolutely certain, but Dr. Brock thinks that will be the issue this time. Owen obviously knew that being past fit to leave Craiglockhart would mean he'd put the worst of his shell shock behind him. But he evidently viewed the prospect of his departure with rather mixed feelings. "Strange if you like," his letter continues, "but I am seriously beginning to have aching sensations at being rooted up from this pleasant region." Well, as I've suggested, I think the particular pleasantness of the region for Owen lay not so much in its geographical features as in the new relationships he'd forged there. The first of these was, of course, with Siegfried Sassoon, which has been well documented many times. And Wilfred's infatuation, to put it no stronger, with Sassoon spills out from letter after letter that he wrote home in the weeks after they met. And at one point, all this clearly provoked some very pointed interrogation from his mother. "Your questions concerning him," Siegfried, "are searching," was Wilfred's response. But he took pains to reassure her and sent home a very carefully worded reply in which he enumerated all the wonders of Sassoon, the man, the friend, and the poet. And now there was Mrs Fullerton, the married lady, of whom I can find no photograph. Perhaps in reaction to that maternal interrogation over Sassoon, which must have been fresh in his mind, since it came only a week or two before Owen started teaching at Tynecastle. When it came to writing home to his mother about Mrs Fullerton, Owen appears to have reverted to the tactics which he had learnt over a number of years: discretion, dating back at least to the time he'd spent over in France. It's noticeable how in these letters Owen manages to suggest that he's keeping Mrs Fullerton at arm's length, if not in the background. She is variously the charming girl, the wife of an army doctor, or in his account of that Pentland's Walk, simply the married lady who slips in and out of view very quickly, whilst each of those four schoolboys gets his own little witty pen portrait. And it's noticeable too in these letters that whenever he describes a meeting with Mrs Fullerton outside the classroom, Owen contrives always to mention how they were in effect chaperoned by some of these students. This was the case on the Pentland's Walk on the 21st of October, though here there were only four boys. Despite its original educational purpose and the status of the two adults as the boys' teachers, the youthfulness of all those involved on this outing meant that it was never likely to be a solemn occasion. And with, in that phrase of his own, much leaping about and prancing for joy taking place, Owen's account of it makes clear that it certainly was not solemn. What shapes his description, however, is much more than just a memory of youthful high spirits amid beautiful scenery. There is also what I might call a layered poignancy, the knowledge shared by both Owen and Mrs Fullerton that their friendship would likely very soon be ended, because both were shortly to leave Edinburgh. The knowledge that his departure from Edinburgh would most likely be a first step on the way back to the front. The knowledge that Mrs Fullerton's reunion with her husband was bound to be no more than temporary. And possibly too, the thought that the four teenagers on the walk with them might well soon tread that same path. To quote another poet of the war, now all roads lead to France. When he concluded his description of the walk homewards from Colinton with that striking phrase, "We knew we loved each other as no men love for long," Wilfred Owen was simply stating a fact. Wherever they looked, whoever they looked at, he and Mrs Fullerton must have known none of this could last for long. Let's pause a moment longer, though, on that phrase, "as no men love for long." Well, that use of men here, tactically convenient, you might think, in a letter to his mother, but I think it's what you might call conventionally generic. He surely intended to include Mrs Fullerton as well as the four boys and himself. And yes, it would be heavy-handed to read into this too much concerning Owen's feelings for Mrs Fullerton, but then it would be equally insensitive to ignore his obvious pleasure in her company. And if we allow into this equation the now common assumptions about Owen's sexuality, homosexuality, we might speculate that each of them in their own way was perhaps a safe companion for the other, the respectable married lady and the unthreatening gay man. But it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves too of the great deal that we already know about the many ways in which Owen's life had been destabilized in the past 12 months or more. And adding to that, the little that we know about Mamie Fullerton, how her life, her marriage had been disrupted by war. Amid such upheaval, neither of them can have been entirely emotionally stable, should we say. Both surely welcomed the escapism and the exhilaration of that Sunday outing. And both must have been acutely aware of the fleeting nature of any enjoyment they might share. The frequent presence of the schoolboys provided a safety net to guard against anything that society or Mrs. Owen might have seen as inappropriate. But it was also, of course, an excuse for those two adults, 23 and 24 years old, remember, to throw themselves wholeheartedly into childlike pleasure and hilarity. As the October days passed, the inevitability of Owen's departure must have become more and more difficult to ignore. And so the intensity of the friendship seems to have risen to an even higher pitch. The next weekend after the Pentlands outing, 27th of October, Owen writes home describing how, today, since 3 o'clock, high jinks reigned at Mrs. Fullerton's apartments. We gave the boys tea and supper. Mrs. F says she never enjoyed so much any party in her 23 years experience. I can say almost as much. We left the house at 9 p.m. Well, just how much more joy and consolation could these two grown-ups squeeze from such an ostensibly child-focused occasion? Mrs. F says she never enjoyed so much any party in her 23 years experience. And it's not difficult, is it, to detect the wistfulness in Owen's, I can say, almost as much. His pleasure perhaps qualified only by the awareness that it couldn't last. And notice, incidentally, the pronoun there. We gave the boys tea and supper. To his mother, Owen represents the high jinks as a party given by him and Mrs. Fullerton for the schoolboys. But you remember, you can see in the date at the top there, this is the very end of October, and Owen knows that he is going to be moved from Craiglockhart in a matter of days. So the high jinks were in fact almost certainly a farewell celebration for him laid on by Mrs. Fullerton. Only 3 days after the hijinks, Owen went once more before the medical board at Craiglockhart, and this time, as he'd expected, and in his own plaintive phrase, he was indeed sent away from Craiglockhart to a new billet in Scarborough at the Clarence Gardens Hotel. In the closing months of 1917, Owen evidently continued to correspond with the charming girl from Tynecastle. In the middle of December, he wrote home to tell his mother that, yesterday, I was sent the Tynecastle School magazine. Very amusing. Mrs. Fullerton writes again this morning, reminding me how I promised to go up there for my first leave. You can imagine our welcome better than I can write, they say. Well, now I find that leave, that's leave from Scarborough, is granted every month. But Mrs. Fullerton's leaving the school forever on the 21st in order to be with her husband, who will soon get sent out again. Did you notice that just slightly over-emphatic forever? And that just slightly unnecessary insistence that Mrs. Fullerton's husband will soon get sent out again? Might we detect a little needle here, a little pushing back after some over-intrusive inquiry about his continuing friendship with the young married lady? At the very least, we might recognise a bit of a pattern in this letter of Owen getting his retaliation in first. Here, as on several other occasions, defending or justifying to his mother a decision to spend his leave somewhere other than back home in Shrewsbury with her. Even more interesting, who is or are they? Right at the bottom there. They who say, you can imagine our welcome better than I can write. Notice how Owen slides, oh, so casually, from better than I can write to they say. just as he does, incidentally, from the school magazine received yesterday to Mrs Fullerton's letter today. A first reading might assume that they encompasses the whole of Tynecastle School, but to whom was it he had made that particular promise? And who is it that now reminds him of it? The more I read, the more I become convinced that this apparent casualness in Owen's letters, this blurring of Mrs Fullerton's presence, is far from casual or accidental. Anyway, on this occasion, Susan Owen was allowed no say in the matter, and a week after his letter, Wilfred was off to spend his leave in Edinburgh. He arrived there early on Thursday, 20th of December, right at the end of school term. After a very busy Thursday morning, he returned to his hotel and took a moment there at lunchtime to make some amends to his mother by reporting his movements to her, before once again going out to see some more Edinburgh friends in the afternoon. He tells her he had reached Waverley Station at some time after 6 a.m. Then he'd gone straight to his hotel and had a big bath and a big breakfast. From there, he went out of the city to visit Craig Lockhart and friends there. And then from there again, and all this is before lunch, remember, from there he went on to Tynecastle. They were in the act of writing Christmas letters to me. My address was on the blackboard and original Christmas cards were all over the room. Mrs Fullerton? Well, she is, shall we say, implicitly present, but not mentioned. His leave was short and Owen was back in Scarborough in time for supper on the Saturday, 22nd. Next day, he wrote again to his mother, filling in a bit more detail of the time he had spent in Edinburgh. The Scotch boys gave me 100 players' cigarettes. It was most touching, for I'd given most of them nothing beyond Hiawatha. We had a great time in Minnie Haha's wigwam on Thursday, dined with the Greys and Mrs Steinthal on Friday. Once again, Mrs Fullerton is implicit rather than present, appearing only as Minnie Haha, hidden behind a regiment of Scotch boys. Time for a little more unpicking, I think. That rather studiedly casual reference to having a great time in Minnie Haha's wigwam on Thursday. Interestingly, that phrase, that sentence echoes consciously or unconsciously his account of his very first day in Mrs Fullerton's classroom, if you remember. Did I tell you what a great time I had on Tuesday? Here, what a great time I had on Thursday. Just as that was his first, so this was probably his last time in that classroom, or any. Following his comment about having given most of the boys nothing beyond Hiawatha, it does rather sound here as though Wilfred's simply describing more of his brief visit to the school on that Thursday morning. And on that reading, Minnie Haha's wigwam, well, it could be a reference either jocularly to Mrs Fullerton's classroom, should we say, or possibly more literally to a mocked up Red Indian teepee within the classroom, if she'd still got one and it was still there right at the end of term. So far, so unexceptionable. But if you think about it, on that reading, it's actually redundant for Owen in his next sentence to specify on Thursday. This is all on Thursday, so he doesn't need to say it again. In fact, what on Thursday does, I think, is to alert us to a parallelism between this and the next sentence. Had a great time in Minnie Haha's wigwam on Thursday. Dined with the Greys and Mrs Steinthal on Friday. Owen, you remember, spent only 2 evenings in Edinburgh, and I think these 2 sentences record his engagements on each of those evenings. So this is not about the classroom. In other words, on his first night back in Edinburgh, he was invited to dine at Mrs Fullerton's apartment. No boys of any number or nationality on this occasion. When they said their farewells after this December reunion in Edinburgh, Owen and Mrs Fullerton had known each other for barely 3 months. There are no more mentions of Mrs F or Minnehaha in Owen's surviving letters, and whether the two were able to continue to correspond into 1918, we don't know. However, it does seem that they at least intended to keep in contact, even if the complications of war made it difficult. In May 1918, Owen had been down to London, meeting various prominent literary figures, including one called Robbie Ross, who encouraged him to get his work published. And Owen came back and began to organise his work for possible publication. And there survives a handwritten list, rather scruffy, but there it is, of the poems he wanted to include. And at the same time, rather endearingly, I always think, he began to compile a list of people to whom this as yet non-existent slim volume should be sent, when it did exist, if. Amongst the select few, there's the list you can see, SS at the top, that's Sassoon, Robert Graves, Leslie, his cousin, and then a little group labelled Edinburgh, and one of them is indeed Mrs Fullerton. As for Mrs Fullerton, to her, the friendship evidently still mattered enough a year on for her to wish to mark the anniversary of their first meeting. And so it is that now, over 100 years on, we can call up from the books in Owen's personal library that leather-bound copy of Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha and find there Mamie Fullerton's dedication in memory of the reading of Hiawatha, autumn 1917, Edinburgh. I think Owen himself would no doubt have appreciated the prophetic, if unintended, irony of that phrase, in memory. I think then there is quite a lot of evidence in Owen's writings to indicate that this was definitely no mere passing acquaintanceship. Mrs F did indeed make quite an impression on Owen, sufficient for him to take considerable care to limit what his mother was allowed to know about it. Well, 100 years on, perhaps, it is difficult to imagine the sensitivities that must have been at work in all of this. Nevertheless, they were real, and the evidence is there in Owen's letters. And I don't just mean in what he wrote. I can quite imagine that some of you may be thinking I'm reading rather a lot into his words. I mean, in addition, the manuscripts themselves of Owen's letters. Now, after his mother's death, Wilfred's younger brother, Harold, took upon himself the role, the duty, I think we might reasonably say, of ensuring that nothing in his brother Wilfred's writing could conceivably compromise the public image of Wilfred Owen that the family was so anxious to sustain. Certainly not liaisons with married ladies. Well, the consequences of Harold's scrupulousness were sometimes dramatic. Here's Harold at work of one of Wilfred's letters. You do wonder what on earth Wilfred had been writing about that Harold felt so strongly. Unfortunately, Owen's letters, the manuscripts, these days, they're rather further away than his personal library in Oxford. They're actually in the Harry Ransom Centre at the University of Texas in Austin. So it's not easy just to pop along and have a look at them. Fortunately, however, the association chair, Jane Potter, has done just that, and she has very kindly shared with me one or two images of those manuscripts. Now, I've mentioned there were just 2 of his surviving letters where Owen actually gets round to referring to Mrs Fullerton by name. One is that one from October, just before he left Craiglockhart, where he describes how hijinks reigned at Mrs Fullerton's apartments. And the other one's the December letter, where he tells his mother he's probably going to spend his leave in Edinburgh because Mrs Fullerton is about to leave Tynecastle School. And if we turn up the manuscripts of those two letters, what do we find? Harold at work again. All reference to Mrs Fullerton, her husband, and Tynecastle crossed out. There's a transcription just in case you couldn't read it all. Harold has carefully circled each line that could possibly, in his view, be compromising, and all this is to be struck out. Fortunately, Harold's editing here. This is the other letter where he talks about being sent the magazine from Tynecastle, Mrs Fullerton inviting him to go and spend his leave, her husband leaving, and so on. Fortunately, his editing here isn't quite as drastic, so we can at least read what it was that he proposed to delete. So in one sense, we're lucky to know that Wilfred even met this charming girl. However, if Harold Owen was quite so determined to deny Mrs Fullerton a part, however brief, in his brother's life, how then did it come about that he agreed to meet her in 1923 and, moreover, to accept this gift intended for his brother? Well, I think, in fact, it can only have been some time after he'd met Mrs Fullerton that it began to dawn on Harold just how strong that friendship must have been. Perhaps, indeed, it was not until he began editing or censoring, you might even say, his brother's letters after their mother had died. Meanwhile, just as she had charmed the elder brother, Wilfred, Mamie Fullerton must also have charmed the younger brother, Harold. And that was how her gift of Hiawatha became part of Wilfred Owen's legacy. But not quite the end of the story, just a little more. Wilfred Owen and the charming girl from Tynecastle School. You remember, one of the strongest clues to the strength of Owen's feelings about this friendship is that description of the walk home from Collington. Poetic material, which ought to have been economized for my serious workshop, Owen called it. And you may also remember my hint earlier on that it wasn't in his poetry that this material was to be reworked. It was, in fact, another letter a few weeks later to Siegfried Sassoon. Leaving Craiglockhart meant for Owen a parting not just from his Tynecastle friend, but also from Sassoon. Since they'd first met in Craiglockhart at the end of August, Wilfred and Siegfried must have been in each other's company more days than not. And it's clear from his letters home how much their time had meant to Owen. Now, to be separated with no certainty about when, if ever, they might meet again was obviously a huge wrench for him and sparked an urgent need to articulate to Sassoon just what their friendship meant to him. And so, when he got back home to Shrewsbury, just a few days after leaving Craiglockhart, Owen tried to get it down on paper for his friend. He'd already tried to write once, he tells Sassoon, and abandoned it. Obviously, it wasn't easy. What he did eventually send has frequently been cited as a key piece of evidence in discussions of Owen's sexuality. I'll read some of the key passages from what he wrote, 5th of November 1917. My dear Sassoon, know that since mid-September, when you still regarded me as a tiresome little knocker on your door, I held you as Keats plus Christ plus Elijah plus my colonel plus my father confessor plus Amenophis IV in profile. That's an Egyptian pharaoh, Amenophis. What's that mathematically? In effect, it is this, that I love you dispassionately so much, so very much, my dear fellow, that blasting little smile you wear on reading this can't hurt me in the least. You have fixed my life, however short. You didn't like me, I was always a mad comet, but you fixed me. I spun round you a satellite for a month, but I shall swing out soon, a dark star in the orbit where you will blaze. What I miss most in Edinburgh, not Craiglockhart, is the conviviality of the four boys. Someday I must tell how we sang, shouted, whistled and danced through the dark lanes through Collington, and how we laughed till meteors showered around us, and we fell calm under the winter stars, and some of us saw the pathway of the spirits for the first time. And seeing it so far above us and feeling the good road safe beneath us, we praised God with louder whistling and knew we loved each other as no men love for long. Wow. Well, I think that's just fascinating. Never mind Sassoon, never mind homosexuality. That paragraph about the walk through the dark lanes through Collington is almost word for word Owen's original earlier description of his outing with Mamie Fullerton. Just a couple of changes. A one-word change, not very important. And another one which perhaps reflects different audiences. To his mother, he says, we worshipped God in our hearts, Sassoon, louder whistling. But as I've tried to show, the lyricism and the intensity of that description derived from, to put it no stronger, his pleasure in Mamie Fullerton's company. And now here we've got Owen struggling to find his feelings, to put it no stronger than that, for Sassoon and about their separation. You notice how many ways he tries to find the words. He tries jokey hyperbole, Keats, Christ, Elijah, my colonel, my father confessor, etc. He tries plain statement, I love you dispassionately so much. He tries imagery, I was always a mad comet, but you have fixed me. He tries coming at it obliquely, what I miss most in Edinburgh, not Craig Lockhart, but in searching for something real, something in his own lived experience, something sufficiently intense and important to act as a touchstone for what he wants to say to Sassoon, he goes straight back to that October walk with Mamie Fullerton. And apart from anything it may tell us about Wilfred and Siegfried, I think that tells us a good deal about Wilfred and his Minnehaha. And very finally, you will have noticed perhaps that in that letter to Siegfried, once again, Mrs. Fullerton is not mentioned. Why not? Now, that Collington walk apparently is all about the four boys, complete with capital letters. What's going on here? Was Owen keeping Mrs. Fullerton hidden from Sassoon, as from Mrs. Owen? That's another story. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any thoughts or comments, I'm very happy for people to email. There's my email address. Jane, back to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was amazing. And if you could hear us, you'd hear us all clapping. I guess we can use our little reactions down there. But thank you so much for that really tender and sensitive reading of Owen's letters, and shows us how much there's still perhaps to be noticed, to be thought about, particularly in relation to Owen's prose and his letters. And that was just amazing. I was absolutely riveted by it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There is a question, there's a lot of thank yous, very insightful, most enjoyable, really thought-provoking. So lots of thank yous from everyone. Meg Crane asked a question, did Harold do any comparable editing of whatever Wilfred may have said about Mady Gray, so Mrs. Gray?
My answer to that has to be, I don't know, because I haven't followed her up. And I certainly hadn't seen the manuscripts of any letters that might apply to that period. So I'll bat that one back to you, Jane.
We'll have to have a look at that one. Yeah. I mean, one thing that occurred to me was that this, I had it in my head, and it may just be my own, I thought I'd read it somewhere, but I could have made it up, that the actual pencil excisions were Susan's, perhaps, at some point. And Harold came along later with the India ink and really went to town on the letters, but and the scissors as well.
Yes.
But I think we're never quite as sure about whether that would have, who had done that.
It's interesting. I mean, as I think you know, Jane, I didn't actually look at the manuscripts of those letters until after I'd done most of the paper here. Yeah. And something else occurred to me this evening as I was reading this through. You remember that letter where he says that they're going to arrange a visit to Swanston Cottage?
Yes.
where the collected letter says half a page is missing.
Yes.
And it suddenly occurred to me, is it actually missing, or is this another one where missing means somebody's scribbled on it or edited it? I wonder again if there is some reference to Mrs Fullerton in the missing passage there. So
Well,
that's
I think
interesting to follow up with.
it's definitely something that you asked me to send you that image, and I will do it. I mean, I think one of the things what I will say is working on the letters is that John Bell was amazing as an editor, and he was very candid about what was actually missing, in other words, excised completely, and what had been taken out by way of not offending living people.
Yeah.
So where it says it's missing, it actually means it's been cut out. And where he says such and such number of lines illegible meant that it was completely excised. Yeah. So you can map it onto that. So in that sense, you know, the collected letters were as candid and transparent as they could have been about the actual material that's there.
Sure.
I'll just see if there are any other questions. So interesting, the family's curation of Owen's legacy and public image. Thank you, Paul. That's from Martin Malone, who also noted earlier that he collected a Vox AC30 amp from Oxgangs only last year. So thank you, Martin. Lots of wonderful, amusing, and comments. Does anyone else want to ask any other questions of Paul? I know we're slightly over time, but if Paul will take any questions.
Can I come back for a supplementary?
Yes, Meg, please do.
Hello, Meg.
Hello, Paul. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm still thinking about Lady Grey. We've got this annoying thing that Wilfred wrote about all women annoying him. And yet he seems to have had a rather good time with at least two of them. And I'm not speculating at the moment on whether or not it was a romantic relationship. Why do you think he's saying that to Susan? Is he warning her off, keeping her at a distance? I think we've all done this with our mothers. Or is there anything else to it?
It's a very good question, Meg. I mean, there is also that passage, I forget exactly where it comes, where he, in effect, tells Susan Owen off and warns her not to treat Colin, the youngest son, in the same way that she treated him, to let him off the leash, let him find things out for himself and not keep him so cooped up. I don't know is the straight answer. Was it to Leslie that he wrote that comment about all women annoy me?
No, I think it came it's in the context of him saying about when he was in France about, there must have been some context of Susan letters, which of course we don't have, where she's worried about him. Sorry, I realize my sound is a bit crackly. Sorry, thank you for letting me know, Bonnie. Where she's worried about him picking up prostitutes and sort of loose women in France. And he's trying to tell her, no, of course not. All women annoy me.
He quite fancied that young girl though, didn't he? At the end.
Yeah.
I had a letter from, I think it was Maisie Gray's daughter, but she actually asked me not to divulge it, so sorry everybody.
Can we have it in 100 years' time?
Maisie Gray, I think, quite fancied Wilfred. That's really what it comes down to, and hadn't got a very happy marriage.
I think Wilfred could be quite a charmer, couldn't he? I mean, Guy Cuthbertson has quite a bit to say about that in his biography, about the circles that Owen moved in around Edinburgh and how charming he could be on occasions when he wished. But I go back to that little sentence that I picked out, the exquisite tact that he identifies in Mamie Fullerton, and I'm sure he played off that. I mean, I don't think she was a woman that annoyed him by any means. I can quite imagine some of the others that he met in Edinburgh did. But I became increasingly fascinated by the way in which the letters were, as it were, moving on a parallel track. And it's difficult to know sometimes quite how deliberately or consciously this was actually going on. Whether in fact he's persuading himself sometimes that he's just telling her as it is, when in fact he's not.
Who knows?
Great. Well, thank you so much,
Oh,
Paul, and thank you for all of you who stayed for more questions. I know that this has really been an amazing talk. I'm speechless, which is not usually something that happens to me. So before I go, on behalf of the committee, I just want to thank you all for coming. If those of you that aren't already members of the association, here's the ad bit. Please think about joining us to help us promote Owen's life and work. Just to remind you that we have a lot of events that we're speaking about doing post-COVID when we can all meet together. But until then, we hope that you will consider joining us for the continuing series, Reading the 1920 Edition. We will meet again 2 weeks from now, I think on the 1st of April. It's not an April Fool's joke. We will be meeting on the 1st of April for the third in our series of looking at Owen's poems, and we will be reading Greater Love and Apologia pro Poemate Meo. I have said that wrong. I'm so sorry. And of course, you can sign up for this via Eventbrite. Bonnie very kindly has put it in the chat for everyone. And of course, our previous 2 events, as this one is on our YouTube channel. So do have a look at that. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you again so much. And can I just finish by asking you to please thank Paul Norgate again for a really wonderful talk.
Yes.
Marvelous, absolutely marvelous. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, and good evening. Thank you very much.
Amazing.
Bye-bye.
Hey, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.